Hi everyone, this video is about async and await in JavaScript. Let's get started. So before that, I want to say a few words about how did we get here. So in the last few weeks, we learned a few methods to handle asynchronous programming in JavaScript. In the first week, we used callbacks, especially with XML HTTP request. If you remember from your homework, you had this fetch JSON method that uses a callback. And we also learned in week 2 that callbacks can be really hard to work with callback hell, if you remember, when you have a lot of nested callbacks. That's why we learned about promises. That solves a lot of those issues. And one of the APIs that use promises is Fetch API, as well as Axios. And in this week, we're going to learn another way how we can handle asynchronous programming using the special async and await keywords in JavaScript. And the reason why we have this is promises are really good. They solve a lot of problems with callbacks. They really help us with managing asynchronous flow in JavaScript using the promise chaining. That's a very powerful tool. However, during the years, the promise chaining was nice, but wasn't perfect. Sometimes the promise chaining is a little bit difficult to understand and to use in a really complex scenarios, and that's why developers introduced async and await keywords to make everything even more easier than before. Now, async and await, they actually use promises, and it's actually a nicer way to use promises, an easier way to use promises. Before watching this video, you'll want to get familiar with promises. So make sure you know how promises work, how to create them, and how to use them. You don't have to understand well the chaining. However, you should be able to understand what is promise and how to use one, and how to create one. Let's get started. So I think the best start is just get coding, and I'll show you all the examples along the way. Here I have my simple index.html file and the JavaScript file. Async and await introduces a new keyword in JavaScript called async. And the way to use it is within the keyword function. So here we're defining an async function. Let's call it getNumber. This is a new syntax, async function. And this defines an asynchronous function. Let's do the simplest thing and have a keyword return here. Let's return, I don't know, 54. Just for comparison, I want to show you a regular function that you all know already. GetNumber, I'll call it sync because it's a synchronous one. And it will do the same trick. So we have getNumber and getNumber synchronous. If we go to Chrome, we'll refresh the page, and let's call first the getNumber sync. So you already know how to use functions in JavaScript. You just call this like that, and yes, I got the results. Everything looks good, just like expected. If you call the getNumber, the asynchronous version of it, if you'll notice that the function itself returns a promise. It doesn't return the actual 54. It returns a promise of the number 54, as you can see. Which means that I can use then and use the result like that. And as we can see, the promise immediately results with the number 54. And this is the main difference between async function and regular function. And the async function is very powerful, and to use it, we use the new special keyword called await. So to use the async function, another keyword is await, and you have to use the keyword await only in another async function. Let me explain. I will define something really simple. I'll define an async function, and I'll call it main. This will be like my main function that everything will happen there. And if you remember, async function of main, if I'll just refresh the page and I'll define main and I will call it, it returns a promise. Because I don't return anything, this promise is the result type is undefined, and that's fine. To use this async, since this is a promise, I can use it like that. I can use then, and here I will just I'll just console log done. That's what I want to do. So let me go back to Chrome. I'll refresh the page and I see done. Because what happens here, we're calling main, which returns a promise, then we're immediately resolving the promise and calling the console log done. Now, the main inside, because main is asynchronous function, in asynchronous function we are allowed to use the special keyword called await. Await is allowed to be used only in async function. So let's see how we use the keyword await. Since we have here, I'm going to delete this. Since we have here the get number, which is asynchronous, we do want to use this and to get the value of 54 inside of the main. And the way to do this is you define a const, and let's say my number, and then we'll use the special keyword await and get number. So two things must happen. First, get number must return a promise, and second, we must be inside in an async function. Only if those two conditions happen, only then I can use await. I cannot use await something like this. It doesn't make any sense. So because of that, what will happen now, when JavaScript will see the word await, it will go to the get number, it will execute the promise, and it will wait for the promise to be resolved. And after the promise will be resolved, it will put the result into my number. So then I can console log my number as it was just simple regular synchronous function. Let's check this out. I'm going to refresh the page and I see 54 because that's exactly what happens. And this is the basics of async await. And as you can see, even if get number could have taken us maybe, I don't know, 20 seconds or something long, this main function will stop executing. It will hold for 20 seconds until we'll get the result of get number. And after the result is known, then it will assign this to this constant and it will continue execution of the function. And you can also have multiple awaits inside of an async function. You can have as many as you want, and then we can print numbers like that. We can just use them. Since that's a number, you can also use the plus sign, so we can sum them. No problem with this whatsoever. Now let's use now a real example from an API, and maybe we'll use fetch to do this. And since fetch returns a promise, we can use it with async await. Let me show you how to use it. I'm going to keep this main function because I do want to use await, and because I have to use await only in async function, I'm going to keep this. And I'm going to keep this as well because I want to immediately execute the function as soon as I load the page. So let's delete the get number. Let's delete the body of this. And let's go to the API that I'm going to use. It's not really an API. It's something that is very easy to use, I think. It's called random.org. That's just a helper site to generate random numbers. So if you go to here, you'll go to the numbers section and click on integers. There's this integer random generation. Then what I'll do, I'll go to advanced mode, and in the advanced mode I will generate only one number between 1 and 100. That's fine. I can keep the one column here. And the last thing that I want as a bare bone text document. So I'm going to select this option and I'm going to click Get Numbers. Here I get a simple document with a number, and when I refresh the page I get a random number. So that's perfect, and we're going to use this to demonstrate how to work with async and await. So I'm going to copy this URL here. I'm going to use this in the examples from now on. So let's maybe save the URL here. Random, let's call it URL. That's the URL. Okay, let's use Fetch API. Fetch API, as you remember, works with promises. And because it works with promises, we can also use async await with this. It works together. So usually, what we did before, we used something like fetch with the URL, and then we use something like then with the result, and here we could console, maybe we did like return result.json, if you remember, and then we had another then, and basically in this then we had already the JSON response. That's actually in our example. I just want to note that we can also, instead of JSON, we can just use text. Since we're just getting text, I'm not interested in JSON. And here, finally, we can console log the text. Well, this is the basic usage of Fetch API, if you remember. And we're going to rewrite this just a little bit, and I'll show you how to use it with async and await. I'm going to leave this example commented out just for you to have some sort of comparison. Well, let's begin. First, we need to call fetch, right? Fetch with the URL. Now, because fetch returns a promise, we can definitely use the keyword await. And we can maybe assign the result of the fetch into a constant, like that. So now, as soon as we call main, it will call fetch, and it will wait for the fetch to return the response, and it will assign the response here to this constant. Now the response here is known. We can, once again, get the text. And since we need to call response.text, and if you remember, response.text, as you can see here, returns also a promise. Because it returns a promise, if I forget the keyword await, think for a few seconds what will be the response of the console log if I forget the keyword await. And the answer is the text will be promise. It's not going to be the string that I want. That's why I want to use the keyword await. And as soon as I have finished executing response.text and I got it into my constant, then I can log it. And that's it. Those 3 lines is how you use Fetch API with async await. So this is 3 lines here with async await and about 6 lines in promises. Let's check if it works. I'm going to enable DevTools, refresh, and there we go. You can see we have a call to the random API here in the network tab, and we get, every time I refresh the page, we get a different number from the API, which is great. And look how short and nice it is. And once again, what happens here is that when you call main, it starts executing, and every time it sees await, it will execute the asynchronous function, and it will suspend the main. It will continue, JavaScript will continue to do other things, while waiting for the fetch to do results. It might do rendering, it might do some other calculation, it might do another API call, and then only then, after we know the results, it will return to the main to the exact point where it left, and it will continue executing the code until it finishes the main. And that's the key of the async and await usage with APIs. And maybe to make things a little bit easier, I want to create a synchronous function. It's some sort of helper tool. I will call it getRandomNumber. The getRandomNumber, it will just call my API. So I will copy this code from main, and I will just use this to get a random number. And in the last step, instead of logging, what I want to do is I want to return, and I want to return the text. Because it's a text and I want to return a number so I can maybe do some calculations, I'll use the parseInt function in JavaScript. The parseInt converts a string into an integer. And if the string is not really a number, if it's like a name or something, then the result will be not a number type in JavaScript. And that's it. This function is a synchronous function, and it uses two awaits inside. So it takes a while to execute this function. And how we use it in main is quite simple. You can now use this in the following way. Const number1 await, and then get random number. Just like that. If you want another number, you can just call it like that. If you want to print them, no problem. So this is how we use very easily. We can now use async and await to handle asynchronous programming in JavaScript. If you remember, using something like this with callbacks, it's very difficult. It's very long. You have to do a callback inside of callback to get two results, one after another. If you want to use promises, you have to chain two promises. And with async await, it's just those two lines of code and another line for printing. Let's see how it works. And there we go. We got two numbers. Every time I refresh, I see two different numbers. I also want to show you the process of how the main is being, of how not just main, just asynchronous function is being executed. I'll console log here as start. And after that, I will log individually after each number was retrieved. So console log number1, maybe number1. And here I will call number2. And we're done. And the done will be printed here. Let's refresh the page and see what happens. So we got start, and then we got two numbers. Maybe I'll make the network a little bit slower to show it in slow motion. Let's go back to the console, start, number1, we're waiting, and number2, and we're done. So as you can see, the main indeed waits until the promise has been resolved and only then continues. It's very different from a regular function that doesn't wait. It just goes from the beginning until the end. And that's the key concept of the promises here. What I want you to do now, we're going to do our first exercise. And in this exercise, I want you to create an asynchronous function that fetches two numbers from random.org. Please use the same method to generate the link that I did. I will also return back to the JavaScript to show you the link. So we're creating an asynchronous function that fetches two numbers from random.org. And I want to return the sum of those numbers. That's it. That's the first task. And the second one, I want you to call this function and console log the result. Those are the two things that I want you to do. So you need to create, let me put this into the bottom. So I want you to create an asynchronous function that fetches two numbers. And I want you to read that this function will return the sum of those two numbers. After you create this, please test this and call this function from somewhere and console log the result. I suggest you to use this URL here, and I will do it something like that. So you can see it maybe one go. You can copy this from the video, or you can just generate this exactly like I did from the website. You can also maybe implement this function, get random number. This will help you because this will just make two awaits for fetch API. This will combine two awaits into one asynchronous function. And that's it. And you can also use this kind of little trick to call your asynchronous function, because you have to use promises somewhere. Since we cannot use await here in the global scope, we're using the regular promise then resolving. Okay, so now you can pause the video and try to solve this exercise by yourself. And of course, continue the video once you're done. Alrighty, so let me show you the solution of this exercise. We've been asked to call the random.org API to get two random numbers. I'm going to use this function, which gives me one number, and I'm going to create a new async function. Maybe I'll call it get two random numbers. Oh no, maybe we'll call it get sum of two random. Doesn't matter. And I will use this function above. So I'll call it once again. I'll call it with await, get random number, and I will assign it to const number 1. And then I will call once again, I'll copy this line. We're getting another number. And then we can just do return number 1 plus number 2. Just like that. So now, this is the solution for the function. This is how you call twice to the random API, and it waits until we have two numbers, and then the function simply returns the result. And let's use it. I'll use it in two ways. The first way, I'll use it with await inside of async function. We have the function here. So let's call it. I'll just define sum, and it's as easy as it is because it's asynchronous function, so we can just call await, get sum of two random, and we'll console log the sum. And let me show you that it works. So I refresh the page and I see that's definitely bigger than 100. So it sums two numbers. And we can see the network tab, we have two requests that you can also check the response here, check the response here, and you can match to see that it indeed matches to the result that you got here. And then another way that you can use this outside of main is just use promises. Since this is an asynchronous function, you can just use it as a promise. So you can use it just like this with a then keyword and a sum and console log it. Just like that. So you can also use promise chaining with asynchronous function. No, nothing stops you. And we get the same result here. So this is the This is the exercise solution. I hope that you managed to do this. And now we will move on into error handling. Error handling is very important in asynchronous calls and in API calls because many things can go wrong. In async await, the way that we handle errors is very similar to the way that we handled errors in previous modules in JavaScript 2, for example, how we handle JavaScript models. In async await, to handle any error, all you need to do is to use the word try and catch, just like in the regular JavaScript. So if we put here try, and if something goes wrong, it will go to the catch. And here we can do whatever we want. We can maybe return -1 or something, I don't know, return 0 or something like that. You can also console log error. And this is how we handle errors. And in this case, if something wrong happens with the getRandom function, then we either so if something goes wrong with this execution of this function, we'll get a 0. So when we will use this function, getRandomNumber, we'll always get some number, even if there was a server error. We can really check this out by maybe changing the URL here. Let's see if it works. Actually, I want to change it here, change the domain. Let's see. I didn't call this. Let's call the function. You can also call await without anything. That's totally fine. But actually, I want to log this. You can also use something like this. You can use await inside of a function, and this will first call the random getRandomNumber, wait for the execution, and then it will use console log to call the already resolved promise. Let's test this. Okay, good. So we're getting an error. We'll see the print, and we're getting 0 as the response for the getRandomNumber. So this is one way that we can handle. Another way, we can also throw our own error. Maybe we can not just do that, maybe we can do something more interesting. We can do so getRandomNumber, if the number is less than 50, maybe you can return some error. Let's call API error here. And here we can do a very simple if. I'll store the number value into a constant after the parse text, the parse int, and I can do something like this. If number value is less than, I don't know, 40, then we can throw an error. And this is how we throw an error in promises. And you can just use the throw new error. Too small. And if everything goes well, we'll get here to the parse int. And if we just refresh the page a few times, and we'll fix our URL here. There we go, 41, 65, 48, and API error. And yeah, and the reason why we got to API error here is because we threw an error. Because we're in the try block, it goes immediately into the catch. So we shouldn't throw the new error inside here. We should probably do something more clever. We should maybe do something like this. I will define response here and the text here, and maybe they will be first, they will be null. And here I'll just resolve them with the await keyword. And because I want to test the API only on those two lines, so I'll put only those two into the try. And here, no API errors, continue processing. Since we handled already the API errors, I can now use this kind of syntax. And note that here I'm throwing an error without a catch, which means that whoever calls this get random number will have to handle this error. So let's see if it works now. So refresh the page, and yes, so we got an error, uncut in promise, error too small, because I guess we got the number 14, indeed less than 40. So because we threw an error here, who got the error is the one that the function that called this the get random number, and that was main in our case. And here in main we don't handle any errors. Because we don't handle any errors, we got this ugly red uncut error into JavaScript. What we can do, we can handle this error inside the main. And one way to do this is just to use try catch, just like before, using try catch. And if something goes wrong, we can log something like get random number resolved with an error. And we can also console log the error. Let's see what happens here. 44, and there we go. So get random number is also in the error, and here we're printing the error. So this is how we handle errors in async await. This is very quite similar to just the regular JavaScript, and it's very easy to use. Another way to handle errors is, I want to show you that don't forget, since the get random number is asynchronous and it returns a promise. So I'll delete this, and another way how to handle errors is to use the regular then, and use catch, because it's a promise and you can use catch to handle errors. Alright, so this is just the same as I did before. Because async await and promises, they're interchangeable. You can work with both and they work together. So this is how we handle errors with promises. And one last thing I want to show you is how easy it is to handle promises. And the way to do this, I'm going to just to make this a little bit shorter, just for us to use. Yeah, we can do something like this. All right, so I'm still happy to handle those API errors. I think that's good. And I want to do something very interesting in the main. I want to call the API like multiple times. And the way to do this with async and await is very simple. Let me show you. I want to call it like 5 or maybe 10 times, and then sum all the results into one number. So I'll call a sum here. This will be a 0 in the beginning. And we can actually use here a regular for loop. It goes from 1 to, I don't know, 10. And just adds get random number. Just like that. So you can even use a for loop. This is a very special for loop because it works in a very different way from what you got used to. Because it's asynchronous, it will just call once, suspend the for loop, and then once we got the first response, it will continue the for loop after we got the results. And it will continue and collect the sum together. Once we're done, I want to maybe log the sum. And let's see. So now we should get 10 calls of getRandomAPI and sum all of those. Let's see if it works. So I'm going to refresh the page. It's probably going to take a while. And then there we go. We got 555. If you go to Network tab, we can see all the 10 results happening in sequence, one after another. Let's clear this and show it again with the Network tab. So refresh the page. And you can see just one after another, very easily, with a few lines of code, we managed to get a for loop with async await. And I think this is a very powerful tool that we can use. It's much easier to do this instead of just using, for example, promise chaining. You can try to do the same thing with promise chaining. It's much more difficult, and with callbacks, it's even worse. It's way worse. And that's the basics, and that's really powerful to work with async await. I want you to do now the second exercise. Exercise number 2 is going to be very similar to what I did. I want you to create async function. I want you to create an async function that uses the random API, random.org API. And the function will behave the following way. The function will call the API and sum all the numbers until it reaches, let's say, 300. After that, return the sum and the number of API calls. So basically what I want to do is I want to start calling the random.org API one after another and sum all the numbers just like I did in the last example. And as soon as we reach 300 as the sum, I want you to return both the sum and the number of times that we had to call the API to reach that. To return two things with the function, I'm just giving you a hint. You can use it just an object or an array. No problem with that. So spend a few minutes now and try to solve this exercise. All right, so let's solve it together. I'm going to show you the solution. And the task is to call the API again and again until we get 300. I'm going to use the main here. Or maybe not. I think I'm going to use a new function. Async function. And we'll call it maybe random API sum. Something like that. Doesn't matter. So we need to do two things. We need to track the sum, the current sum, and we also need to track the number of calls. So let's do this. First, I will track the number of API calls. API calls. It starts at 0. And also the sum also starts at 0. Let's just start calling the API. I'm going to use while loop because I think that's appropriate. And while the sum is less than 300, what I'm going to do, I'm going to increase the API calls by 1. And after that, I'm going to increase the sum by calling await and get random number. And after that, I'm going here, because here, after the while finishes, then we already reached to 300. Right? So I can just return the sum and the API calls I'll just return it in an object because I want to return two things. And this still has to be, of course, a synchronous function because we don't know when it's going to finish. It might take a while. We don't, in this case, we don't even know how many API calls are we going to do. So that's quite interesting. Let's test this function. And I'm going to log the results here. Let's check this out. I'm going to clear the network tab. I'm going to clear the console. Maybe I'll keep the network tab here just for us to see the requests are going. And I'm going to refresh. There we go. We got some requests. And after a few requests, we got the sum of 301 with the 7 API calls. Let's try again. We're waiting, and we got 6 API calls with 340 as a sum. So this works. And let me give you another explanation how this works. We're using the while loop, and the while loop will just continue while this condition here is true. And along the way, we're also tracking the API calls and the sum. And we're using here, to increase the sum, we're using await get random number. So we're using as a synchronous function. And again, I just want to remind you that when we call get random number, it stops the execution of the function until we get the result of this. And this concludes another very cool way how we can use the API calls. One example I want to show you is to call this multiple times. So in our example, we called get random number a few times, one after another. What if I want to call them like together at the same time? We can use promise.all. We know that we can use promise.all, and here we need to put a list of promises. Now, because get random number here returns a promise, I can definitely do something like this. This will look a little bit weird. Maybe it will be easier if I'll do this. I'll just keep this into. So here we have an array of 3 promises, and I just want to execute all of those together like we learned. And you can use await because it's a promise. And you can store the result here, all results. And then you can console log all results. So this line of code will execute the get random number 3 times, but this time it will do this in parallel. And only after all of those 3 numbers are generated, then we get here an array of all the results, and we'll just log it. Let's see how it works. I'm going to refresh, and there we go. We got 1, 2, 3 numbers from the API, and the calls are also, they should be happening in parallel, but I think what happens here is Chrome somehow prevents, maybe it's something in my Chrome, but it prevents it from doing real parallel. You see there is this stalled here in the middle. So what happens is probably Chrome doesn't let you do too many requests into one domain. So this is something that's maybe in my computer, but it should do if it was on different APIs. It was happening in parallel. And this concludes my example for async await. As you can see, we did some very complex examples in very easily with async await. And this is why we have this async await, because sometimes promises are very complicated to handle with difficult tasks. And I just want to show you a small comparison here between the 3 methods that we learned. So I'm going to focus at the moment in the first table in the using. So assuming that you want to use some sort of library that uses an API, there are three ways to do asynchronous programming in JavaScript. The first way is to use callbacks, and then callback will probably have two parameters. One is error and one is the actual result. And we have to use the if statement to check if we have error, then we should handle it. If not, then we should handle the data. Promises just split this ugly if into two sections. In promises, when you have some API, you'll use then to get the result to know that it succeeded, and you can also use catch to get the error. So it's even much easier to use. And you can also chain promises. You can have multiple thens and catch for all of those, much easier than using callbacks. And this week we learned about using async await. To use a synchronous function, we have the keyword await, and await stops the execution of the current function, waits for the result, and then continues. And then to get the success, to get just the variable from await, we just assign it to a variable. We just use the keyword await. And to handle errors, we're using just the regular try catch, just like JavaScript synchronous programming. Now let's get to the table below. Table below is when we create promises, when we create a function that is asynchronous. If you want to create a synchronous function, we have also three ways. We can use callbacks, and then we have another third or fourth, or the last parameter of the function will be a callback that we will call as soon as we will know the result. So we're going to call a callback with null and data if it's a success, and we're going to call the callback with error and null if something went wrong. And promises, we just use resolve and reject. If you remember, you're creating a new promise, and then you either resolve the promise or you reject the promise. And async await, it's even easier. If you want to return a data, you just return a data, no problem. And if you want to throw an error, you just throw an error, just like that. So here we have three ways of using asynchronous programming in JavaScript. You must be asking yourself, well, which one should I use? Or which one maybe most people use in the industry or in big apps? And the answer is quite complicated. In my opinion, you should use the one that's easiest, which is async await. And the bad news is that you probably won't be able to use it all the time. Async await is relatively new. It doesn't support in all the old browsers, and you still find sometimes some old APIs that use callbacks. So you're going to use probably all those three here and there. You're going to see usages of promises a lot. I think your promises will be a lot, and if you see an API that has promises, you can automatically use async and await, which is a very big advantage. So to conclude, I think you should use async await as much as possible because it's so easy to use, unless you really need to use other methods like promises or callbacks. And that's what I think. For me, it's very easy to use. And yeah. So that was the video about async and await. I hope that you now know the difference between the three asynchronous programming types in JavaScript. And thank you for watching, and wish you a pleasant day.